The wagon wheels creaked against the frozen dirt road as Martha Henley clutched her worn leather satchel closer to her chest. Through the bare branches of towering Douglas firs, she caught her first glimpse of the Johnson cabin, a rough-hewn structure that seemed to crouch against the mountain like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, the only sign of life in this wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction. She had traveled 3 days from Portland, answering an advertisement that promised room, board, and $20 a month for a woman willing to tend house and mind 4 boys. What the advertisement hadn't mentioned was just how far from civilization she would be, or how desperately she needed this chance at a new beginning. As the wagon driver helped her down, Martha's boots sank into the muddy snow that clung stubbornly to the shadows. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the distant crack of an axe biting into wood. She smoothed her dark wool dress and adjusted the pins, holding her auburn hair in place, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. At 28, she had learned that first impressions were everything, especially when you were a woman alone in the world with secrets that could destroy any chance at respectability. The cabin door swung open with such violence that Martha startled backward. A massive man filled the doorway, his shoulders broad enough to block out the dim light from within. Jigger Johnson stood 6 feet 4 inches in his worn work boots, his dark beard streaked with premature gray, and his blue eyes holding the wariness of a man who had been disappointed too many times. Behind him, Martha caught glimpses of movement, small figures darting in the shadows like wild creatures avoiding a trap. "You, the woman from the employment agency?" Jigger's voice rumbled like distant thunder, neither welcoming nor hostile, just tired. Very, very tired. "I am Martha Henley, sir. I've come about the position." She kept her voice steady despite the chaos she could see unfolding behind him. A tin plate sailed across her line of vision, followed by the sound of shattering crockery. Someone was either crying or howling, she couldn't be sure which. Jigger stepped aside reluctantly, as if allowing her entry might be a mistake he would regret. The interior of the cabin assaulted her senses immediately. The sharp scent of unwashed bodies, mixed with the stale odor of old food and the acrid smell of ashes that had been allowed to accumulate in the fireplace. Clothes lay scattered across the rough-planked floor like fallen leaves, and dishes were stacked in precarious towers on every available surface. In the center of this chaos, 4 boys moved like a pack of wolves, wild, unpredictable, and completely without supervision. The oldest, who Martha guessed to be around 12, had climbed onto the kitchen table and was conducting an elaborate sword fight with a wooden spoon against an invisible enemy. His brown hair hung in tangled knots past his shoulders, and his clothes were stained with what looked like a week's worth of meals. The second boy, smaller and more cautious, was systematically feeding pieces of bread to a mangy-looking dog that had somehow found its way indoors. The third child was engaged in building what appeared to be a fort out of overturned chairs and moth-eaten blankets, while the youngest, barely more than a toddler, sat in the corner sucking his thumb while tears tracked through the dirt on his round cheeks. "Boys," Jigger's voice cut through the mayhem like a blade. "This here's Miss Henley. She's gonna be helping out around here." 4 pairs of eyes turned toward Martha with expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility. The oldest boy, still perched on the table, looked her up and down with the calculating gaze of someone far older than his years. "Another one?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "How long you figure this one will last, Pa? A week? 2, if she's real stubborn?" Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her expression neutral. She had faced worse than a pack of unruly children. At least these boys were honest in their rejection. There was something refreshing about that, after months of polite lies and whispered gossip. "I suppose that depends," she said quietly, setting her satchel down on the only clear spot she could find, "on whether you're willing to give me a chance to prove myself." The silence that followed was so complete that Martha could hear the wind whistling through gaps in the cabin's chinking. Outside, the first fat snowflakes of what promised to be a hard winter were beginning to fall, and Martha realized with a mixture of terror and determination that there would be no going back now. Whatever happened in this isolated cabin with this broken family would determine not just their future, but hers as well. The first night in the Johnson cabin taught Martha more about survival than all her previous hardships combined. She had been given a narrow cot in the corner of the main room, separated from the chaos by nothing more than a thin curtain that one of the boys, she suspected the third one, Jake, had already torn in 2 places. Sleep came in fragments between the sounds of scuffling, whispered arguments, and what she was fairly certain was someone relieving themselves in a chamber pot that hadn't been emptied in days. When dawn broke grey and cold through the single window, Martha rose to find the kitchen in an even worse state than the night before. Jigger had left before sunrise for his work in the logging camp, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note: "Boys need feeding. Good luck." The 4 children sat around the table like judges at a trial, their arms crossed and their expressions ranging from defiant to merely uninterested. Tommy, the oldest, had appointed himself spokesman for the group. "We don't need a mother," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been forced to grow up too fast. "We've been doing just fine on our own. The last 3 women who tried to tame us all ran off crying. You might as well save yourself the trouble and catch the next wagon back to town." Martha studied each face carefully, noting the way little Sam's lower lip trembled despite his attempt at bravado, how Billy's eyes kept darting toward the door as if planning an escape route, and how Jake's hands were clenched into small fists beneath the table. These weren't hardened criminals. They were scared, grieving children who had learned that the only way to protect themselves was to reject before they could be rejected. "I'm not trying to be your mother," Martha said quietly, rolling up her sleeves. "Your mother was irreplaceable, and I would never presume to take her place. But I am here to help, whether you like it or not. And the first thing we're going to do is make this place fit for human habitation." What followed was the most exhausting day of Martha's life. The boys tested her at every turn, hiding dishes she needed, accidentally knocking over buckets of water she had hauled from the well, and engaging in increasingly elaborate pranks designed to drive her away. When she tried to organize the kitchen, Jake dumped flour across the floor. When she attempted to do laundry, Billy released the chickens into the cabin, creating a chaos of feathers and squawking that took an hour to resolve. Tommy watched it all with the calculating gaze of a general observing a battle, waiting for the moment when she would finally break. But Martha had learned patience in a harder school than most. She cleaned up each mess without complaint, her movements steady and methodical. When Jake scattered the flour, she simply swept it up and began again. When the chickens invaded, she calmly herded them outside and continued with her work. By evening, she had managed to clear enough space to cook a simple meal of beans and cornbread, the first hot food the boys had eaten in weeks. The turning point came when little Sam, exhausted from a day of rebellion, began to cry. Deep, heartbroken sobs that seemed to come from the very center of his being. Martha moved toward him instinctively, but Tommy stepped between them, his young face fierce with protection. "Don't," he warned. "Don't you dare try to comfort him. That's not your job." Martha looked at the 12-year-old boy who had been carrying the weight of his family on his shoulders for too long, and her heart broke for all of them. "You're right," she said softly. "It's not my job. But maybe it could be my privilege if you'd let it." The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Finally, Sam's sobs grew so intense that Tommy's resolve cracked. He stepped aside just slightly, and Martha knelt beside the little boy, gathering him into her arms as naturally as breathing. For a moment he resisted, his small body rigid with the memory of loss. Then something inside him surrendered, and he melted against her, his tears soaking through her dress as she whispered wordless comfort into his hair. When Jigger returned that evening, he found a scene that stopped him in his tracks. The cabin was cleaner than it had been in months. The boys were seated around the table eating actual food from actual plates, and Martha was mending a tear in Sam's shirt with quick, efficient stitches. The transformation wasn't complete. There was still wariness in every face, still challenges ahead, but for the first time since his wife's death, Jigger allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this woman might be different from all the others. 3 weeks into November, Martha had learned that winning over the Johnson boys required the patience of a saint and the cunning of a fox. Each child presented a different puzzle, and she approached them like a master craftsman, working with 4 distinct pieces of wood, each requiring its own technique to reveal the beauty hidden beneath the rough exterior. Billy, the quiet 10-year-old, was the first to truly surrender. Martha discovered his secret one morning when she found him in the barn, whispering stories to a litter of barn cats. His voice was soft and musical, spinning tales of brave knights and magical kingdoms that transported his feline audience to worlds far beyond the harsh realities of mountain life. Instead of interrupting, Martha listened from the shadows, her heart swelling with recognition of a kindred spirit. That afternoon, she casually mentioned that she had brought a few books from Portland, including one about King Arthur and his knights. "I don't suppose you'd be interested in hearing about Sir Lancelot's quest for the Holy Grail?" she asked, apparently absorbed in her mending. Billy's eyes lit up like candles in a dark room, though he tried to hide his enthusiasm. "Maybe," he said carefully, "if you're not too busy." From that moment, Billy became her shadow, helping with chores in exchange for stories, his hunger for adventure and beauty finding nourishment in Martha's gentle words. She taught him to read the more difficult passages himself, and soon he was devouring every book she owned, his imagination finally having found proper fuel. Jake, the 8-year-old troublemaker, proved more challenging. He seemed to view life as a constant battle against authority, his energy channeled into increasingly creative acts of defiance. Martha watched him for days, noting how his mischief always escalated when he felt ignored or unimportant. The breakthrough came when she caught him trying to carve his initials into the kitchen table with a dull knife, his face set in concentration. "That's beautiful work," she said, startling him so badly he nearly dropped the knife. "Your father mentioned you have a gift for carving. Would you like to learn how to make something special?" Jake's suspicion warred with curiosity. "Like what?" Martha retrieved a piece of soft pine from the woodpile and her own small carving knife. "Like this," she said, and began to shape the wood with quick, sure strokes. Within minutes, a tiny horse emerged from the pine, its mane flowing as if caught by wind. Jake's eyes widened with wonder and something that looked dangerously close to respect. "Could you teach me to make one?" he asked, his voice smaller than she had ever heard it. "I could teach you to make something even better," Martha replied, handing him the knife. "Something that's uniquely yours." Soon Jake was spending his evenings carving by the fire, his restless energy finally finding constructive outlet. The pranks didn't stop entirely, but they became less destructive, more playful than malicious. Little Sam remained the most fragile, still waking in the night calling for his mother, still flinching when adults moved too quickly. Martha's approach with him was different. She simply made herself available, a constant, gentle presence that asked nothing but offered everything. She would hum while she worked, the same lullabies her own mother had sung, and gradually Sam began to drift closer to the sound. When he skinned his knee playing outside, he ran to her instead of Tommy. When nightmares woke him, she was there with warm milk and whispered comfort. Tommy, the proud leader of his small tribe, held out the longest. Martha knew that winning him would require more than stories or crafts or gentle comfort. He needed to see that she wouldn't abandon them, that she could be trusted with the responsibility he had carried for so long. She proved herself through consistency, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast, staying up late to mend their clothes, never complaining about the endless work or the boys' occasional relapses into wildness. The moment she knew she had truly won came on a particularly cold evening when she found Tommy teaching Sam to tie his shoes, his voice patient and encouraging. When he looked up and saw her watching, instead of scowling or turning away, he smiled, a real smile, full of the boyish joy that had been buried beneath too much responsibility. "Ma always said Sam would learn when he was ready," Tommy said quietly, using the word Ma for the first time since Martha's arrival. Guess she was right. Martha felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. "She sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Tommy agreed. I think she would have liked you." That night, for the first time since arriving at the cabin, Martha fell asleep to the sound of genuine laughter echoing from the boys' room. And she knew that somehow, against all odds, she had found her way home. December brought the first heavy snowfall, and with it, a quiet intimacy that settled over the cabin like a warm blanket. The world outside became a pristine wilderness that trapped them together in the golden circle of firelight, creating a cocoon where hearts could slowly thaw. Jigger began returning from the logging camp earlier each evening, drawn by something he couldn't quite name, but couldn't resist. The chaos that had once greeted him at the door had been replaced by scenes that stirred memories he thought he had buried with his wife. Martha would be at the stove, her sleeves rolled up and her face flushed from the heat, while the boys clustered around the kitchen table with their various projects. Billy reading aloud from one of her books, his voice gaining confidence with each passage. Jake carefully carving a wooden whistle, his tongue poking out in concentration. Little Sam helping sort buttons or beans, his chubby fingers working with determined precision, and Tommy, the eternal guardian, overseeing it all with the satisfaction of someone whose burden had finally been shared. "You've worked magic here," Jigger said one evening, accepting the cup of coffee Martha offered him. Their fingers brushed as she handed it over, and both of them felt the spark that had been building for weeks. "Not magic," Martha replied, settling into the chair across from him while the boys played quietly nearby. "Just patience and a little bit of love." Jigger studied her face in the lamplight, noting how the harsh lines of exhaustion had softened since her arrival, how her eyes held a contentment he recognized because he felt it too. "You never talk about before, about your life in Portland." Martha's hands stilled on the mending in her lap. "Some stories are better left buried." "We all have them," Jigger said quietly. "Stories we'd rather forget, but sometimes sharing the weight makes it easier to carry." For a long moment, Martha was silent, her gaze fixed on the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I had a family once, a husband and a little girl. Sarah was 6 with golden curls and her father's laugh. There was a fire in our boarding house. I was at the market when it happened. By the time I got back," she stopped, her throat working against the words that wouldn't come. Jigger reached across the space between them and covered her hands with his own. "I'm sorry. Everyone said it was God's will, that I should accept it and move on. But how do you move on from losing everything? How do you trust that kind of love again?" Her eyes met his, and he saw in them the same fear that kept him awake at night. "Maybe you don't trust it," Jigger said slowly. "Maybe you just try again anyway, because the alternative is dying while you're still breathing." The silence that followed was charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. They both knew they were standing at the edge of something that could either save them or destroy what little peace they had found. Around them, the boys continued their quiet activities, unaware that the adults were negotiating the terms of their family's future without saying a word. "The boys need stability," Martha said finally, her practical nature asserting itself even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "They need a mother," Jigger corrected. "And I need someone who understands that loving again doesn't mean forgetting what came before." Martha looked around the cabin that had become her sanctuary, at the children who had claimed pieces of her heart she thought were dead forever, at the man whose quiet strength had sheltered them all. "What are you asking me, Jigger?" "I'm asking if you'd consider staying permanently as my wife, as their mother. I know it's not romantic, and I know we're both scared, but maybe scared together is better than alone." Before Martha could answer, little Sam appeared at her elbow, rubbing sleepy eyes. "Martha, will you sing the bedtime song?" She lifted him onto her lap automatically, her voice soft and warm as she began the lullaby that had become their nightly ritual. Over his downy head, her eyes met Jigger's, and in that moment, surrounded by the family they had somehow created together, the answer became clear. The announcement of Jigger and Martha's engagement should have been a cause for celebration, but the joy that filled the Johnson cabin was short-lived. Word traveled fast in the small mountain community, and with it came whispers that grew louder and more venomous with each telling. Mrs. Eleanor Hastings, the self-appointed moral guardian of their settlement, had taken it upon herself to investigate Martha's background, writing letters to contacts in Portland and uncovering the tragic story that Martha had fought so hard to leave behind. The confrontation came on a bitter January morning when a delegation of townsfolk arrived at the cabin, their faces stern with righteous indignation. Mrs. Hastings led the charge, her voice sharp as winter wind as she addressed Jigger while Martha stood frozen in the doorway. "Mr. Johnson, we've come as your neighbors and friends to warn you about the woman you've taken into your home. This Martha Henley isn't who she claims to be. She's Martha Sullivan, and she's got blood on her hands." Jigger's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "I'd advise you to be very careful about what you say next, Eleanor. The fire that killed her husband and child, it wasn't an accident. She left a lamp burning when she went to market, despite her husband's warnings about the faulty wick. Her own negligence killed her family, and now she's trying to steal yours." The words hit Martha like physical blows. Behind her, she could hear the boys stirring, sensing the tension, even if they couldn't understand the full meaning of the accusations. Tommy appeared at her shoulder, his young face fierce with protective anger. "That's a lie," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Martha would never hurt anyone." Mrs. Hastings' expression softened with false sympathy. "Oh, child, I know she's fooled you all. But a woman who causes the death of her own family cannot be trusted with yours. Mr. Johnson, surely you can see the danger you're putting these innocent boys in." The crowd murmured agreement, their faces a mixture of genuine concern and sanctimonious satisfaction. Martha felt the walls of the life she had built crumbling around her, the careful facade of respectability stripped away to reveal the guilt and shame she carried like a scar across her heart. "She's right," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible. "I should go." "Like hell you will." Jigger's voice cut through the morning air like an axe through wood. He stepped forward, placing himself between Martha and the crowd, his massive frame radiating protective fury. "I don't care what happened before. I care about what I've seen with my own eyes. This woman has brought nothing but love and peace to my family." "But Jigger," Mrs. Hastings pressed, "surely you must consider—" "I've considered everything that matters," Jigger interrupted. "And what matters is that my boys are happy, healthy, and loved for the first time since their mother died. If you can't see that, then you're not the friend I thought you were." The delegation retreated, but their damage was done. That evening, as Martha packed her few belongings with trembling hands, the boys stood guard like small soldiers, their faces set with determination that broke her heart. "You can't leave," Billy said, tears streaming down his cheeks. "We need you." "Where will you go?" Jake demanded, his carved animals clutched in his hands like talismans against loss. Little Sam simply clung to her skirts, his sobs echoing through the cabin like a funeral dirge. Even Tommy, trying so hard to be strong, couldn't hide the devastation in his eyes. "I'm trying to protect you," Martha whispered, her own tears falling freely now. "If I stay, they'll make your lives miserable. You deserve better than the shame I've brought." But as she looked at the family she had come to love more than her own life, Martha realized that some fights were worth having, some love worth defending, no matter the cost. The wedding took place on a Sunday morning in February, not in the community church as originally planned, but in the Johnson cabin with only the family present. Reverend Matthews had agreed to perform the ceremony despite the controversy, moved by the obvious love that bound this unlikely family together. Martha wore her best dress, simple but clean, with wildflowers the boys had gathered from the hothouse at the general store. Her hands shook as Jigger slipped the plain gold band onto her finger, but her voice was steady as she spoke the vows that would make her officially what she had already become in her heart. The real confrontation came 3 days later, when Mrs. Hastings and her supporters arrived to deliver their ultimatum. The entire settlement, they claimed, had voted to shun the Johnson family unless Martha left immediately. No more trading at the general store, no more help during emergencies, no more welcome in the community they had called home for generations. Jigger listened to their demands with the patience of a man who had already made his decision. When they finished, he stepped onto the porch with Martha beside him, and the boys ranged behind them like a small army. The winter sun caught the gold of Martha's wedding ring as she took his hand, and for a moment, the sight of their united front gave the delegation pause. "You want to know what I think about your ultimatum?" Jigger's voice carried clearly across the snowy yard. "I think you're a bunch of cowards who've forgotten what it means to show Christian charity. This woman has done nothing but love my children and bring peace to my home. If that's not enough for you, then we don't need your friendship." Tommy stepped forward, his young voice clear and strong. "Martha is our mother now. She chose us, and we choose her. If you can't accept that, then you're not the kind of people we want to know anyway." One by one, the other boys moved to flank their parents, their message unmistakable. Billy clutched one of his beloved books. Jake held a wooden horse he had carved for Martha, and little Sam wrapped his arms around her waist with fierce determination. Mrs. Hastings' face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "You're making a terrible mistake, Jigger Johnson. Mark my words, no good will come of this." "Good has already come." Martha spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but unwavering. "I've learned that family isn't about blood or perfection. It's about choosing to love each other despite our flaws and standing together when the world tries to tear us apart." As the delegation retreated in defeat, old Pete Morrison broke away from the group and approached the porch with his hat in his hands. "For what it's worth, Jigger, some of us think you're doing the right thing. That woman has made those boys happier than I've seen them since their mother passed. Sometimes love is more important than reputation." Inside the warm cabin that evening, as Martha helped little Sam with his letters and listened to Billy read aloud, while Jigger and the older boys worked on a cradle for the baby that would arrive in the fall, she finally understood what home truly meant. It wasn't a place or a building or even the approval of others. Home was this: the sound of laughter echoing off log walls, the feeling of being needed and wanted, the knowledge that no matter what storms came, this family would weather them together. She had built her cabin in their hearts, and they had built theirs in hers, creating something stronger than blood, more lasting than stone. In choosing each other, they had chosen love, and love, Martha had learned, was always worth fighting for.